Pete Nova with the Broncos War Room. Week 9 is in the books. Week 10 is here. Thank you so much for joining myself and my co-host, Lou Scataglia. Today, we are here to preview the Las Vegas Raiders, who are going on the road to face the Denver Broncos in the Mile High City. We are going to talk about last week's game against the Houston Texans and a little bit of the trade deadline and what happened and maybe what didn't happen. But let's jump into at least last week's game. Lou, is there a player that comes to mind for you that you felt like stood out in that matchup against the Houston Texans?
Yeah, the offense was kind of forgettable, and I think we expected kind of a dogfight on that side of the ball. I mean, outside of a few sharp runs from JK and obviously the 2 touchdowns, no one really stood out on offense. I mean, the offensive line protected well, but Zach Allen was a man on a mission against a pretty much a bottom 5 Texans offensive line. I guess it's no surprise that he had himself a game. He finished with a sack, a TFL, and 3 quarterback hits, which is insane production in one game, even though the numbers might not pop out. If you just think about if someone did that over a 17-game season, they would probably win the Defensive Player of the Year. It's also important to note with the pass rush, a lot of times players creating pressure doesn't result in necessarily a statistic, but collapsing pockets allows, Benito and Cooper to get home and to get sacks. So Zach Allen was probably the best player on that defense, maybe save for Dre Greenlaw. He was creating a ton of interior pressure. He was making life difficult for CJ Stroud. And then obviously when Davis Mills came in, I was a little bit worried there when he went down with that injury. I think that was in the second half. It looked really bad at first. Just seems like maybe he got the wind knocked out of him. I do believe he finished the game, but Zach Allen was sensational in this game. And I mean, he has been worth every penny that the Broncos have paid him and then paid him previously. Zach Allen was phenomenal in week 9.
Yeah, when we look at Zach Allen, I feel like you would be remiss to not talk about John Franklin Myers a little bit
Oh,
too.
sure.
And John Franklin Myers kind of reminds me a little bit of Derek Wolfe in that, he did a lot of the dirty work to
Yeah.
open up things for Von Miller, especially on like a lot of those stunts and the Texases where he's kind of looping around where, crashing in and then a guy going around him. So I feel like we're seeing a lot of that with John Franklin Myers where
Yeah.
it may not show up on the stat sheet, though this was probably one of the best games from a stat sheet perspective for Jonathan Franklin Myers. 4 total tackles for him. He also had 4 quarterback hurries and ultimately also had 2 stops, right? So John Franklin Myers is a guy that's doing a lot of dirty work. And when we talk about this defensive line with Zach Allen, DJ Jones, Jonathan Franklin Myers, Wazarike, who, there were
Sure.
some that said he should have been cut after that Colts game.
He's been great.
And they stood with him. So this defensive line has been awesome. And as you noted, right, this is against a matchup against an offense that is really, really struggling on that offensive line. And look, they got the job done. They did what they were supposed to do. And we can't take anything away from them in that regard. Let's take a look at another player here, and we won't spend too much time on it, but Dre Greenlaw comes to mind as well as another positive. 4 tackles for him, 3 assists, 4 defensive stops, which is really good to see. And Lou, you mentioned it in the pre-show, but not on the injury report this week, which is the first time that we've seen so far since he did pop up with that injury months back. That kind of lingered, of course. So Dre Greenlaw has looked phenomenal as well and as advertised. What did you see from Dre Greenlaw? I mean, it just feels like he's bringing some sort of edge to this defense that already has one, but it's cranking it up a little bit more on that side of the ball.
Yeah, and I think Sean Payton actually touched on this just the other day when he was speaking with the media recently, saying that he just brings an off-the-field element, like an attitude to the unit that, again, was already there. But Dre Greenlaw is kind of notorious for being like crazy, but in a good way. I even remember after Bo's long run on that final drive, the first person to give Bo an attaboy was Dre Greenlaw, but he didn't just clap and then smack him on the back. He was like screaming in his face, like in a good way. Dre Greenlaw just kind of brings that schmutz to the defense that I think it feeds into everyone else on that unit. It was such a good signing, and the frustrations of him not playing for the first half of the season were real. Just because we were exposed to more Alex Singleton, which is never a good thing. But Dre Greenlaw being out there, even if he's still being worked back into the lineup into more of a full-time role, his presence, the attitude, just how fast he plays. I mean, this is someone who was taking the field so fast in the Super Bowl a couple years ago that he ruptured his Achilles. That's just how intense he plays. You can tell he really encapsulates what it means to be an NFL player. And what I mean by that is the average NFL career is only about 3 years. So while you're able to play in the NFL, why not give it 100%? Dre Greenlaw is awesome, and I am very glad to see him not on the injury report at all. It leads me to believe that here in the coming weeks, we're going to kind of see that Band-Aid ripped off even more, and maybe we'll see his snap count increase, 50, 75%, and then hopefully by the end of the year, he's seeing close to 100% of the snaps on defense.
Yeah, and as you noted, right, those snaps should increase. It'll be interesting to see if Alex Singleton sees his snaps decrease, or him and Stranad almost kind of from like a baseball term, but become kind of like a platoon there,
Sure.
at that position. I'm not expecting it. I think they feel loyal to Singleton, and I don't think they're going to make that change. And Stranad's a really good special teams player, but
Yeah.
Singleton also made his hay starting his career as a special teams guy. So we'll see how that shakes out.
Yeah.
Let's talk about a negative here. Bo Nix and Evan Ingram, right? We were expecting when Evan Ingram signed to be this, everyone wants to throw the word around, but the Joker, right? And just a guy that can create mismatches, for an opposing defense in the pass game. And we just really haven't seen it. When you think back to the preseason game where they hit, Evan Ingram on that drag route where he
Yeah.
catches the ball in space and takes it like 40, 50 yards from Jarrett Stidham, like we just haven't really seen it. And the one thing I would say about Ingram, while it has been frustrating and we haven't gotten that high production from a tight end like we've been hoping for, I think
Mhm.
it's important to also note that, Bo Nix hasn't really hit him, with the opportunities when he has been open, right? We see
Sure.
that wheel route up the sideline this past week, and it goes
Yeah.
over Evan Ingram's head, and Ingram gets up, and you can see he's visibly frustrated. And I would be too, right? I mean, he comes in, new regime, expecting to maybe be in the best situation of his career,
Yep.
gets injured, right? And then it's really been a slow start or slow ramp up from there. He's also not playing as many snaps as you would have hoped. And the final thing is, and I'll kick it over to you, is so one way to kind of make it and spin it into a little bit of a positive for Evan Ingram is, I will say, when they've needed to move the chains, especially in late in the game, he has came through for them. I think back to the Eagles catch where it moved
Yep.
the drive and moved the sticks along, and then obviously he ends up scoring the touchdown. Right?
Mhm.
You look back against the Giants where he had a
Yep.
nice chain mover late in the game. Right? He
Yep.
has been there in the critical moments and has come up big with some nice catches. It's just really about, like, we just haven't seen him have like a strong outing, for all 4 quarters. And I think partially that has to do with Bo Nix.
Yeah, I mean, Bo's been good this year. He's definitely missed some throws. There were a few throws that he missed to Ingram in week 9. I mean, Ingram was blanketed in week 9. He had a stretch there where he was catching 4 or 5 passes each game, but he's never had more than 5 receptions in a game. And I mean, he's averaging, I think, under 9 yards per catch. Um, I also think there is something to be said about, again, the way he's used. I do think because Sean Payton changes personnel so much, and this is the one downside. This is something that everyone's talked about. When you change personnel so much, and a group of playmakers are on the field, and then the very next play you swap them out for three other ones, you can't really allow a ton of players to get into a rhythm. Ingram is the best tight end on the team. I know that he doesn't bring much as a blocker, but he wasn't signed to block. He was signed to catch passes. It's easy for me to say, well, just keep him on the field, but you can't necessarily keep him on the field when you run the ball because he's not really someone who can block in that regard. I will say, though, that maybe this is kind of lining up with what we've heard some of the coaches talk about. Like, we've even seen Benito and Cooper see their snap counts decrease in previous weeks. And we've heard the coaches talk about, well, we want to make sure they're fresh for the long run. So maybe same thing with Greenlaw. Maybe this is something where in the coming weeks, maybe even after the bye, we kind of see some of those top, blue chip important players like Benito and Cooper and Greenlaw and even Ingram see an increase in the snap count and see a bigger role in the game. I do think overall, no matter what you want to look at in regards to Ingram, it has kind of been rather disappointing. He is getting paid top tight end money, and he's not really producing at that level. I don't just think it's one specific thing, but I mean, I guess we'll see. Denver has some favorable defensive matchups coming up. So we'll see if Ingram can get going. This is a completely different discussion. It also goes back to them not being able to grab a tight end in the 2025 NFL draft, which was just absolutely pathetic. But there really isn't much more to say here. I mean, we want to see Ingram get more work on the offense. Maybe, it'll come, but I guess at this point, it's really only a matter of time, I guess. Shoot,
Sure.
I mean, I guess there isn't really much more you could say here.
Yeah, and I think that's fair, and I don't we don't need to harp on it too much.
Right.
I think your points are valid there. Before we get into the matchup for this week, we'll talk a little bit about the trade deadline. Spend a couple of minutes here. It was reported that Denver was in play for Jalen Waddle, and it looks like the Dolphins tried to ask for at least the first and more assets in addition to that. I'm probably in the minority of look. I would have loved Jalen Waddle for a first. I don't know if I would have given up much more. He has struggled to stay on the field with injuries. The contract is a solid contract. It's not overly expensive, but it's not cheap either. But I would say it would have been nice to pair him up, especially in this window right now where the AFC is the weakest it's been in a couple of years. And so you sit there and you say to yourself, would this have been a nice spark? And you're projecting that first rounder to likely be late. But I can also understand if it seems like the Dolphins were asking for a lot outside of the first. And I don't know if I would have paid much more than just a first. But that's me. I would have loved to get Logan Wilson, who goes to the Cowboys for very cheap. I think that's the one deal that I look at and say, I'm kind of bummed they weren't in on that. David Njoku doesn't get moved. A lot of these names that we were hoping would have got moved did not, which not surprising. Chris Olave stays with the Saints, and overall a disappointing trade deadline for Denver. A lot of contenders did not make moves, but you can also sit there and say that's when you should be making the moves, right? And it seems like, unfortunately they're going to stand pat. It's something that we've heard in the past before, and it doesn't sound like that's changing. It seems like they're going to make splashes in free agency next year, but free agency year over year lately, not less and less talent is making it to free agency. And so, I'm not overly excited about them spending money next year. I care about them this year. So I'm a little disappointed, and I'll let you get to it. But one last thing, I would have liked to see them add a little bit of depth on the offensive line, which unfortunately they did not. And we talked about that last week. But what are your overall thoughts on the trade deadline? And, are you with the masses of, hey, this is pitchforks out and, super frustrated? Or are you kind of even keeled? Where are you at with that?
Yeah, I think if you didn't feel the need to add now in this situation, when will it be enough to add? I mean, you're tied for the best record, not in the AFC, but in the NFL. You are one bogus leverage penalty away from being 8-1 and the standalone best team in the AFC and best record in the league. So I am actually like, I'm kind of livid. And now, obviously, I don't know as much as George Paton and Sean Payton, so it's easy for me to say here as an armchair GM and say, well, they should have done what it took to trade for somebody. But to be rumored to be in the market for, we heard rumors that they were in the market for a tight end, for offensive line depth, for a wide receiver, linebacker, if I didn't mention that. And to come away with nothing it is kind of disappointing. And I do think the one downside that I believe exists with George Paton as the GM is that, and this is even something with Sean too, is they love their guys, maybe almost too much, right? Yeah. We have seen Sean bring in an insane amount of former players and coaches from the Saints. We have seen George Paton. He loves his draft picks, which is awesome. But there comes a time where you are so close and you are on the cusp of something that is so hard to get to that, this is the time to make a move. I understand the argument of, well, we're 7-2 with our guys, so why make a move? Well, your tight end room still kind of stinks. You don't have a number one receiver. Your linebacker room is still kind of iffy outside of Greenlaw. This roster is very good, but it's also flawed. I get it if you don't want to give up a first for Jalen Waddle, but even to not flip a 6th-round pick for, Joel Bitonio, who is going to retire after this year and who's a free agent, to improve at guard for a few more weeks. It's kind of puzzling to me because, again, if now isn't the time to add, then when is it going to be enough? I'm overall disappointed, but I understand why they didn't add. I was ready for a big move, and maybe like you said, Pete, maybe it'll just come in free agency.
Oh, I mean, that's not really what I want to hear or what I want to
Yeah,
think. The nice thing is, if we're or the crappy thing is, David Njoku, even if you brought a guy like him in like next year, you also have Evan Ingram. So it's like, what do you do? I think he'll hit
right.
free agency. Mark Andrews would be really nice. I think he's
Sure.
definitely going to hit free agency, but he's a little bit different. He can block, so maybe you can
Yeah.
make hay with that. But I don't know how much assets they're going to invest in the tight end room. We'll see how they
Sure.
come out from this year with. But I'm okay they didn't make the splash. I'm not okay that they didn't add any depth whatsoever,
Yeah.
especially on the offensive line. That's really where my frustration lies.
Sure.
But let's go ahead and look at the upcoming game here versus the Raiders on Thursday Night Football. Injury report wise, pretty clean for the Raiders, right? No DMPs on Monday and Tuesday, or at least no DMPs on Tuesday. A couple of guys limited, but nothing overly concerning. They're probably going to be relatively healthy. The
Yep.
one guy that's no longer there is Jacoby Myers that gets
Yep.
traded at the deadline yesterday. But he's also a guy that had been limited, but I think that was more so to do with the fact that he didn't want to play with them anymore,
Yeah.
and he gets shipped out. Let's talk a little bit about Denver, Lou. Obviously, a couple guys missed last week. What is the report saying, and who are you expecting to make or maybe miss the game on Thursday night?
Yeah, so Nate Adkins and Pat Surtain are still DNPs. They both, I think they have knee and pectoral injuries. They were expected to miss a few weeks. So them being DNPs is no surprise. Surtain, I think at best could be back the week after against the Chiefs because we'll have a 10-day rest period. Although I wouldn't be surprised if they are angling toward Washington after the bye in week 13. Adkins, both of them were not placed on IR. So that means Denver is expecting them back within a month. So we're about halfway there at this point, actually. So maybe they come back soon. Marvin Mims is the big one. He actually returned in a limited fashion from his concussion. That weird situation. He shouldn't even have been on the field on the play that he got concussed on, which is don't even get me started with that. But he was limited yesterday. Leads me to believe that maybe he could be at least limited or even full today, and maybe even have no game designation. I feel like once you clear the protocol, you probably don't usually have a game designation because you're cleared from the protocol. I would probably expect Mims to practice fully today. I'm not the independent NFL neurologist working with Mims, but the fact that he was limited leads me to believe that he's trending in the right direction. And then we had a few secondary players pop up, but just because we're on a short week, I think Denver is being extra careful with anything that pops up. Like Brandon Jones and Raleigh Moss were DNPs yesterday. They were back in limited. I'm sorry, 2 days ago. They were back in limited fashion yesterday. So I would expect that they would probably be full and ready to go. Will Lutz popped up as a DNP with an illness. I believe he should be fine. Again, I'm not a doctor. I don't know what kind of illness he has, but generally speaking, unless it's a major illness, those guys, kind of work out off to the side away from everybody and then are good to go for game day. So overall, Denver is in a good spot. The players that are expected to miss games will miss games, but we could be getting Marvin Mims Jr. back, which is going to be awesome for the offense. So overall, injury report, good spot.
Yeah, I think the Mims addition is huge, at least for the special teams, right? We saw the muffed punt in the Texans game,
Yep.
which ultimately shifted a little bit of momentum. And I saw a lot of people say, well, CJ Stroud was injured, and if he played, it would have been different. And keeping in mind, I mean, Denver lost an all-pro punt returner in Mims who wasn't playing in that game. No Patrick Surtain. And ultimately, look, while Stroud and I don't want to get off track here, but while Stroud and that offense were moving the football a little bit to start the game, keeping in mind that the offensive play calling, it feels like Sean was coaching initially to not lose that game
Yeah.
and then open things up again later on. But you figure quarterback is out, two really good defenses. You don't want to make a mistake and turn the ball over,
Right.
which we talked about in preview last week. And then,
Yep.
so I think the game would have looked a lot different if Denver had to open it up.
Mhm.
So I think it's not really fair to bring up CJ when you also factor in, the fact that Denver was missing a couple guys as well.
Absolutely.
But With the Raiders, they are a 2-6 football team. The spread in this game is 8.5 for Denver as the favorites. Now, usually the favorites get about a 2.5 point for the spread. That's usually what they get for the home field advantage, sometimes even 3, but that's changed over the years. So you figure on a neutral site, Denver's likely favored by about 5 points in this matchup,
Yeah.
which is a pretty significant amount of points in the NFL to be favored by. When you look at the Raiders, though, it makes a lot of sense, right? This team right now, 16.5 points per game, which is 29th in the NFL, 26.3 points per game allowed, which is 23rd in the NFL. So they're losing by an average margin of 10 points in their games this year. Not even losing, they're just averaging 10 points lopsided in terms of the points allowed and the points scored. But the one thing that the Raiders do edge out Denver in, which is not many places, is the penalty department. They've been pretty disciplined in that regard. Pete Carroll has them, doing what we would have thought Sean Payton would have had them doing, which is being disciplined, not a lot of penalties. 52 for them, 9th best in the NFL. Denver has 20 more penalties, which is 30th in the NFL in terms of, just how bad that is. And you factor in 20 more penalties is basically at this juncture almost a little bit more than 2 penalties per game more. Denver, if they want to win this game, they need to ensure that they are not taking the Raiders likely, who is a divisional opponent. It is a short week. Denver is traveling home while the Raiders were home, and they traveled to Denver. A little bit of more of an advantage for them than it is for Denver in that regard. So they have to play disciplined football, and they have to play clean and not allow a divisional opponent to keep this game close. What are your key takeaways in this game? Is there anything specifically that you're looking for with the Raiders? And is there any advantages that you see for the Raiders in this game, or is it really all lopsided for Denver in your mind?
Yeah, so not to be a doomer, because I did predict the Broncos to lose last week. I get the unfortunate feeling that this game is going to be closer than it needs to be, only because the Raiders do nothing well, and that kind of scares me.
Sure.
It wasn't until last year that the Broncos actually beat the Raiders. They actually ended up having a longer losing streak against the Raiders because they had snapped it with the Chiefs back in 2023. So they ended up having a losing streak against the Raiders only in the AFC West. But I mean, the one thing that really sticks out to me with the Raiders is just how ridiculous Brock Bowers is. In his return from injury, he missed the entire month of October. He went off, I believe he caught 12 of his 13 targets for almost 130 yards and 3 touchdowns against a really good Jaguars defense. And with no Surtain in this game, I have no idea what the plan is going to be to keep Brock Bowers at bay. The good thing is he's really their only relevant player, rookie running back Ashton Genty. And maybe this isn't all his fault, is averaging less than 4 yards a carry and just has been kind of forgettable this year. I do question the Raiders for using a top 10 pick on a running back when they need, everything else pretty much, but that's neither here nor there. Ashton Genty was billed as this generational immediate success, and we really haven't seen that. I mean, J.K. Dobbins has obviously been way more efficient, so I don't really think Vegas is going to have a very easy time running the ball, despite them having a household name at the position. No Jacoby Myers. He got shipped to the Jaguars, so that's good. Jacoby Myers is, I think, a very underrated player. One thing I did notice, and this just goes back to what you alluded to earlier, how bad their offense is. They have 5 games this year with 20 points or less, and they have no games with 30 points. So more than half of their games, they are scoring 20 points or less. This offense is just dreadful. Geno Smith has as many touchdowns as interceptions, and it took him until week 9 to actually achieve that milestone. For a while there, he had more interceptions than touchdowns. Geno Smith has been, frankly, horrible this year. I know that, he always typically completes a high percentage of his passes, but anytime your quarterback is throwing as many interceptions as touchdowns, something hasn't gone right. So for Denver, I look for them to maybe expose the incompetence at the quarterback position, and then hopefully take away any threat of the run game early, and maybe force Geno Smith to drop back and throw the ball, because that's where Denver can thrive. But my overall thoughts is that the Broncos should win this game, but because it's a divisional game against the Raiders on a short week, and because the Raiders don't do anything well, I'm also a little bit worried that this game could be closer than it needs to be.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think this game ends up being a little bit closer than maybe some will have it pegged. Vegas has them at 8.5, right? So Vegas, keep saying Raiders because they play in Vegas now.
Yeah.
Vegas has this pretty much as a blowout by their standards. The one thing a little bit concerning for me, and it's not necessarily a concern, but maybe just an advantage when looking into the numbers. Geno Smith is tied per next gen stats, is tied for second highest success rate throwing against the blitz, 55.3% of the time this season. And that's despite him being pressured sixth most in the NFL. Denver is blitzing at the fourth highest rate in the NFL, and they've allowed the 14th lowest success rate when blitzing, compared to, the lowest success rate being 32 when not doing so. So they've actually been better when they aren't blitzing this year. And so I would hope that Denver feels confident enough to get home. And with Patrick Surtain not being there, you tend to want to feel more comfortable blitzing when
Yeah,
you feel much more
exactly.
comfortable with the secondary. But with Patrick Surtain not being there, I expect them maybe to not dial up the blitzes as much as we've seen,
Mhm.
because Geno, 4 touchdowns, 0 interceptions against the blitz. And this is a guy that has thrown a lot of interceptions this year. We're talking about he's thrown 11 interceptions on the season, and that's up there for the worst in the NFL. So I just hope that Denver can get home, and I think they can. Part of the reason Ashton Genty has struggled this year is that offensive line is just terrible, right?
Yeah,
Jackson Powers Johnson, they don't know where to put him. They had him
yeah.
as a center. He looked great last year. Then they moved him to guard, and then he wasn't starting at one point behind like Alex Kappa, right? Then he is playing. It's just been a really weird. Pete
Mhm.
Carroll's son, I don't really know what he's doing with that offense this year, but it's looked really really bad.
Yeah,
And it's one of those situations where nepotism is not working in the favor
no,
here for the Raiders. But they also lose their best offensive lineman at left tackle a couple weeks back. And that was after Genty had his best game against the
yeah,
Bears, where he was running a lot of outside runs. And so I think that's part of the reason they've struggled. I think Denver should win this game in the trenches. And I think we've talked about it, and a lot of people are sharing their thoughts on it as well. But the trenches have been huge for Denver, and I think what makes Denver different this year than we've seen in years past is they're absolutely dominant on both sides of the ball in the
yeah,
trenches, and they have depth, at least on the defense. But the offense, while I wanted them to add depth, their
yeah.
depth has came through with Palchevsky,
Sure.
while Matt Parrott and their why am I
Ben
why am I
Powers.
blanking? Ben Powers. I almost said Jackson Powers Johnson.
Oh
Ben
boy.
Powers goes down as well. So the depth has shown up in that regard too. And I think the trenches it's just adding a different element for this team from a toughness standpoint. And
Yeah,
Denver's pushing people around rather than what we've seen, especially on the run on the defensive side of the football, being pushed around themselves, which has been really awesome to see
yeah.
from a tone setting standpoint.
Yeah, I think the last thing I'll add to this, I think maybe before we get into some of our predictions, is that, and I think I said this last week, but maybe I'll say it every episode. There are three pillars of a winning NFL team being able to sustain success. You have to have the quarterback, which the Broncos appear to have. You have to be able to protect the quarterback. Can't have your quarterback running for your life, and that's the one thing that Sean Payton has always emphasized is being strong on the offensive line. The first thing he did was sign Ben Powers in free agency, signed Mike McGlinchey. We already had Miners and Bowles, and Wattenberg has been a functional starter, nothing more. But and even with Ben Powers out, Alex Balcheski has been great. And the last thing, you have to be able to get to the quarterback, which is the Broncos have the best sack differential in the NFL. So they maybe quite literally are the best team in the NFL at protecting the quarterback and getting to the quarterback. More times than not, you are going to win games if you can do those things at a high level, and then having someone who is as clutch in the fourth quarter as Bo Nix is helps. So this is another game where the Broncos should dominate the trenches, and even in today's NFL, games are won and lost in the trenches. So Denver should have a good time on Thursday in that regard.
Yeah. And let's talk about the players here that we're looking at. One player for me is RJ Harvey. RJ Harvey is tied with Mike Egbuka when it comes to receiving touchdowns for rookies this year. He's got 4, which is tied for the most in the NFL. And we've seen him come through scoring touchdowns, right? 5 touchdowns in the last 3 weeks. He's had a touchdown in every single game the last 3 weeks. And we've seen RJ Harvey at home this year has
Yeah.
been a player that's been much more successful than we've seen him him on the road. He
Mhm.
catches 5 passes for 50 yards last week, which was really nice to see him kind of blend. I mean, we're seeing that kind of, we talked about the Mark Ingram, Alvin Kamara kind of vibe where,
Yeah.
Mark Ingram did a lot of the dirty work. Alvin Kamara did a lot of the receiving work. And we're kind of seeing that start to come to fruition a
Yeah.
little bit. We're not there just yet, but it's still kind of starting to uptick here. I think RJ Harvey has a really nice game. I think they give him more touches on the ground where
Mhm.
they've started to give JK a lot more of the rushes as of late. I think we start to see a more balanced attack where they get both guys involved in a matchup that's very, very favorable for Denver, especially on the offensive side of the football, especially running the football. Outside of Max Crosby, there's really not many players here on
Yeah.
this defense that you're sitting here worried about. And the only guy maybe is Devin White from the
Sure.
Buccaneers. While he racks up a lot of tackles, if you watch him on film, though, he makes a lot of head scratching decisions.
Mm.
He's not where he's supposed to be a lot of times. I think Denver can take advantage of that with a really,
Sure.
really stout rushing attack.
Sure. I'm definitely watching out for some of the wide receivers in this game. The Raiders, against opposing wide receivers, they've allowed the 5th most receptions. They're actually very good defending the tight end. So this could be a big game for one wide receiver at least. And it feels like every week the Broncos have at least one wide receiver that does kind of pop off. We have seen that a little bit with Troy Franklin this year. Cortland Sutton is obviously the best one in this room. But with Marvin Mims potentially returning, I would look out for a big game for Marvin Mims, just because he's such an explosive player. And we have seen him create so much down the field, like against the Giants. He had that deep reception, I think, on like a 3rd and 11. He's got very good hands. He's just someone that I believe needs to touch the ball more. And even though he might feel like more of a gadgety player at this point, he's still someone who has the knack for the big play. And with him back in the lineup and the Raiders not being great containing opposing wide receivers, I would be shocked if a wide receiver didn't have a massive game. The Raiders, and I mean, the main reason why is the Raiders don't really have any good cornerbacks on the roster, and that's kind of been a trend for them for years now. For whatever reason, they love to sign the washed up cornerbacks, and I think they did that recently this year. They may have cut them already, but the Raiders just kind of struggle in the secondary, and that's kind of been a thing for years now. So I'm personally looking out for any wide receiver to have themselves a big game against a pretty shaky secondary.
Yeah, you have Jeremy Chin back there, who at once was a really, really highly touted corner. You have Polo Mau, who has been really, really bad at the free
Yeah.
safety position. You have Stokes over there at corner. He's a solid player, a lot of speed, not as consistent though. So it's definitely a matchup as you noted. And you also have Jamal Adams, who's kind of playing that Sam linebacker position at this point
Yeah.
for them. She's not really playing in the secondary, but let's take a look at the predictions and our thoughts. I'll go through mine first, and then I'll shoot over to you. I think Denver, Geno Smith, 11 interceptions this year. Denver's only generated 4 total this year. I think Denver gets 2 turnovers from Geno Smith, at least 1 interception. I think Hufanga gets his first interception this year. We've seen him come up very, very close, and it feels
Yep.
like we're wish casting it every single week, but we feel like, I mean, it's got to happen, right? It feels like he's always in the right spots. He's
Yep.
playing at an all-pro level,
Oh, yeah.
Hufanga. I don't think Denver covers the spread. That's at 8.5, like you had shared. I think that game ends up staying tight. And I ultimately, like I said, yeah, I think Geno turns the ball over 2 times. So two turnovers from Geno. Denver doesn't cover the spread, and Hufanga gets his first interception. That's my prediction, and Denver ends up winning this one. I think it's a game where we sit here and it's like another 24 to maybe like a 17 game where Denver
Yeah.
doesn't cover by a point or two. But I think it's a close game. What are your thoughts? What are your predictions?
Yeah, I definitely agree that it's going to be a close game. I do like your Hufanga prediction. It does feel like he's like dropped interceptions even last week against the Texans on that deep shot that Hufanga defended well. It felt like he should have caught that. And I know he would probably say the same thing. But as for my predictions, I do think Brock Bowers has a long touchdown with no Surtain. It's going to be pretty hard to keep him at bay. And Geno Smith, the one thing Geno Smith does well is he knows how to get the ball to his best players. Brock Bowers did burn the Broncos for a long touchdown last year in Denver. You probably remember it kind of felt like a broken play. And I even think PJ Locke was the primary defender in coverage on Bowers, which is not a good idea. Brock Bowers is a generational player. He's going to catch a long touchdown. My second prediction is that we have a long touchdown to a wide receiver. I think we get Marvin Mims back. And I did kind of notice last week against the Texans, Denver really tried to push the ball down the field a good bit. Maybe I'm not super accurate there, but it just felt like Sean Payton and Bo Nix just were testing down the field a whole lot. It just felt like they wanted to throw the ball a ton. I think they connect on a long 50-plus yard touchdown against a pretty shaky Raiders secondary. And then my last prediction, I'm going to get on my soapbox for a few seconds, is that Will Lutz kicks another game-winning field goal. Will Lutz is freaking awesome. I love Will Lutz. He did miss a field goal against the Colts that maybe would have decided the game, but he's come through. He hasn't missed an extra point this year, which we are coming to find out that's really important. Shout out to the Giants' former kicker who gifted us that win. He made a game-winning kick against the Giants. I think he's made all of his 50-yarders besides one, which was blocked last week, which is awesome. He made a 50-plus yarder against the Jets, which ended up deciding the game because we won by 2 points. He made a long field goal against the Eagles, and he also kicked the walk-off field goal against the Texans. Will Lutz is awesome. I love him. He needs to be extended. While I don't want Denver to be in a position where they need to kick a game-winning field goal against the Raiders, I kind of have a feeling we will. So I'll say that Will Lutz, for the third time this year, kicks a game-winning field goal at the buzzer for the win.
Yeah, I can absolutely see it. And you know, it's funny. We are so far from the Brandon McManus experience, and he's had his struggles too with the Packers. It's funny how much Denver was paying him, and the outrage and the cry of frustration that Sean was bringing in his guy, and people were so mad that how dare the Broncos let go of Brandon McManus, who was a guy that did a lot more talking than he did producing on the field, at least at the back end of his career for Denver. Sure. But respect to him. I mean, he was a big part in that Super Bowl 50 run and was a very, very good kicker for Denver for a very long time. But as you noted, it's very, very important, right? So many teams are struggling with kickers this year and in years past. And it's so valuable to have a guy that you can rely on. And Sean, with a little nudge to him before the final kick in this, it's just one of those things, man. And like, and people sit there and they hate on Sean Payton. And I get it, right? If you love him when he's yours and you hate him when he's not, it's kind of that Aqib Talib, but for a coach, like that's that kind of vibe that you get from him. But ultimately, his players love him, right? Will Lutz talked about how important the confidence is that Sean gives him, right? They've been together every single year of his career except one, right? J.K. Dobbins brought up how much Sean Payton means to him and how much he'd love to stay in Denver long term. Like everybody that's in the building that buys in tends to love Sean Payton, and everybody on the outside, especially the media who doesn't always get the access that they want or the answers that they want, tend to have bad things to say about Sean Payton, but it's more props to him. So I guess I'll get on my soapbox there and talk a little bit about Sean Payton. Credit to him. There are things he's not perfect. There are things that drive me nuts with him, and there are certain things that he says that I kind of wish he would just not say, but that's, you live by the sword, die by the sword with him. He's been awesome for Denver, just like Will Lutz. But we're super excited for this game. If you guys have any questions, feel free to like, subscribe, and leave comments below. Again, just starting this thing, more content to come. We appreciate everybody that's supported so far, and we'll see you guys next time.